Well, welcome, Wellers. My name is Jeremiah Chaney. I've been attending the Well for close to 20 years now. Recently, have undergone a pretty significant career change, and I have left an 8th grade U.S. history classroom and am now currently the executive director of an organization called the 1833 Leadership Academy. 1833 is an organization that's committed to inspiring people to make a difference with their lives, really through the incorporation of 8 core virtues and an emphasis on relationships, specifically relationships focused on accountability and building trust. And at 1833, it's our belief, it's my personal belief as well, that relationships focused on those two concepts of accountability and trust really do allow you to develop significant amount of influence in people's lives. And that influence in people's lives really help to inspire them to make a difference with their own lives and also help to develop your own relationships with them. It's been a pretty incredible journey for me, just in terms of leadership. I personally do not consider myself a leadership guru whatsoever. The highest, I guess, position or title that I've ever attained is an 8th grade girls and boys head basketball coach, and that's been the extent. I've been involved in coaching and teaching and in different aspects of leadership for my whole adult career, but I'm not a person that's ever been quote unquote in charge of a group of people. However, I am, I guess, considered the executive director, but the organization is an executive director of 1.5, and that's just myself and my wife. So again, would not consider myself to be an expert whatsoever. So these reflections are really based on just my own observations, my own deep dive, and probably my own self-reflection. So I wanted to just first talk about kind of my own journey into leadership, and that was when I went to my grandmother's funeral in 2013, and she passed away, and she was 103 years old. She had lived a really, really amazing life. And when I went to her funeral, my experience with funerals at that point was kind of anybody over the age of 80. There was really not a lot of people that attended the funeral, obviously because most of the people that they had done life with had passed away. And so I wasn't really sure what to expect when I went to her funeral right around Cincinnati, Ohio. And I showed up at her funeral, and there was over 500 people at her funeral at 103 years old. And I was absolutely blown away with what the people that got up and spoke about her had to say. And what was really interesting was that she had actually lived on a farm by herself until she was 99 years old. And she fell and broke her hip, and they put her in a nursing home. And they said she was, kind of counting down the days, she was never gonna walk again, et cetera, et cetera. Well, she ended up living in that nursing home for another 4 years. And I would say 75 to 80% of the people at that funeral were the people that she had influenced during her time at the funeral home, the last 4 years of her life. And at that point, I really had to ask myself a question, and I really asked the question: if I was to die right now, if I got in a car accident and I passed away right now, how many people would come to my funeral? And I had to really kind of consider that question. And it was at that point that I really tried to shift and move things around in my own life and try to live a lot more intentionally. And at the core of what I kind of realized is that everything is based on relationship and the relationships you have with people. And that, to me, is really the essence of leadership. And John Maxwell says that leadership is influence, and I think that's totally true. The question that I've kind of done some more discovery on is that, well, how do you go about attaining influence? Because influence is great, but how do you go about doing it? And you go about doing influence through developing relationships. And in order for you to develop healthy, meaningful relationships, you have to go about conducting your life with trust and accountability at the forefront of that. And I have found that those two concepts are, again, kind of easy to think about, maybe a little bit more difficult to do on a day-to-day basis. Especially as humans, the concept of accountability is, I think it's a daily battle. There's a lot of days that we love accountability and we're totally fine with accountability. But then there's other days I'm just not a big fan of somebody holding me accountable. And you know, my wife would probably attest to that. You know, there's plenty of opportunities that marriage thing is a great accountability factor, and some days we're fine with it and other days we kind of put up some walls. So I guess my tidbits here are really just self-reflections and just an honest look back in my own life and realizing the work that I need to do and the work that I need to continue to do when it comes to accountability. So, two of the core virtues at 1833 are integrity and humility. And these two words, I think, are at the forefront of what we start to talk about in terms of how to build relationships. When we talk about integrity is really operating your life in oneness or wholeness. And it's kind of your actions meet your words. But one thing that I thought I would just kind of pass on in terms of integrity, sometimes we tend to move into BCD behavior. There was a book that Urban Meyer wrote several years ago called Above the Line. And in that book, he talks about BCD behavior. And BCD behavior stands for blame other people for your problems, complain about your circumstances, and defend your actions. And these are all characteristics and traits that we as human beings do probably every single day. Some of you might have already exhibited some of those at this point when you're taking a look at this video. So I point those out because I think that's a very actionable step for you to think about when you think about leadership. Blaming other people for your problems, complaining about your circumstances, defending your actions, or making excuses. And those are obviously the direct contradiction to accountability. But I think visually, if you really think about it, if integrity is your foundation about how you go about your business, it's the strength of who you are. Every time you blame somebody else for a problem, complain about your circumstances, or defend your actions, you start to create cracks in your foundation. And if you're having cracks in your foundation, it's very hard to operate your life with integrity. And if you're not operating your life with integrity, how do you conduct yourself to create trust with how you go about your business? And so just kind of talking about avoiding BCD behavior to strengthen one's integrity, because those two are actually like counterintuitive to each other. So that was just a quick observation that perhaps somebody might find applicable. The bulk of the time I actually wanted to talk about the word humility. Now, humility is a very, very interesting word. And I think humility specifically applies very much to the life of Christ, obviously, and certainly something that we all can do a little bit deeper a look at and kind of identify the concepts of humility and how it applies to us. And truth be told, the other thing is I don't think that there's a better leader for us to look at than Christ if we kind of talk about the dynamics of his life and what he accomplished. And in terms of influence, his life meant, this massive growth of a new ideology, and Christianity in general just blossomed. And if you look at foundationally about how it blossomed, he poured into the lives of 12 disciples who then went out and spread the word. And I think that's a great example just of authentic, pure leadership at a very simplistic level, because those 12 people that he inspired were average, everyday people, probably from the lowest parts of society. They weren't even like the super high important people. They were fishermen. They were tax collectors. Like the lowest of lows, he pours into, inspires them, and then they go and multiply the impact. And it's pretty impressive. And I think that helps, certainly helps me kind of contemplate, yeah, I have a role to play in this. I have work to do, and there's things that I can continue to enhance in my own life. A simple, educator of 25 years, I still have a lot of work to do, and I can still do a lot of work and make a difference. So, I wanted to talk to you about humility. Humility as a word is a very interesting word study, and it's actually undergone a significant connotation flip. And so I just wanted to talk to you about that for a second. Humility, by definition, means, very simply, a noble choice to forgo your status, deploy your resources, or use your influence for the good of others before yourself. 3 characteristics of humility. Number 1, it has to come from a height of above. So it has a dignity aspect to it. And so when you operate with humility, you are literally like lowering yourself to a different level. Humility is also willing, and it's also social. So relationships are at the heart of humility. What's very interesting to me for the word of humility, humility is based on Greek and Latin roots. The Greek word tapenos is one of the root words of humility, and for the Latin word, it's humilitas. And if we go back to the ancient Greek and Roman societies, those societies were based on a shame, honor type of situation. So society basically said you were either going to be somebody that has shame, or you're going to be in pursuit of honor. And humilitas specifically was used to describe those people that were literally low to the ground, or were the lowest of lows of society. So the absolute opposite of honor. And so it was not a positive type of word used on people. And what's interesting is that when Christ was born and he lived his life, he spent the majority of his life ministering and operating with the lowest of lows. That's all he spent his time with. And he was so effective in his ministry that he actually attained honor after working with those shameful people. And he was elevated to a position of honor and glory and praise. And at the height that the Palm Sunday, when he heads into Jerusalem, at the height of his ministry, he is worshiped and glorified and is at the very top. And lo and behold, what does he choose? He chooses the most shameful form of death in crucifixion on a cross. And he dies. And then what's really curious is once he dies, the word humilitas and humility, the entire connotation of humility, flips on its head. And it becomes something that his followers and the early church promoted, and humility becomes something that we all strive to attain to. And I find that to be super interesting in terms of just applying to my own life and the power of humility and how that speaks specifically to relationships. And so as we do that kind of deep dive into humility, humility really does open ourselves up for accountability. And the more humility you have, the more you seek accountability from the people around you. And therefore, that is inherent in leadership, is that concept of humility. I have read and I have seen in multiple places that of all the characteristics of leadership, and there's 1,000 of them, right? The most important concept to effective leadership is humility. Because not only do you hold yourself accountable, do you open yourself up to accountability, do you allow yourself to be vulnerable to the people that you're in charge of, to the people you're doing life with, but you also demonstrate this consistency to serve. And when you are working alongside and you are serving with those people that you're trying to lead, that speaks volumes to them and also develops significant influence in their own lives. I'm a sports guy, and I really love sports. I've been involved in sports my whole life. And I read this book called Captain Class. Captain Class is a book written by a man named Sam Walker. Sam Walker created an algorithm, and he stepped away from his job as a New York Times reporter, created an algorithm to determine dynasties. And he went around the world, and he identified, I think, 15 to 20 different dynasties that fit his algorithm. And from those dynasties, he then specifically grabbed hold of the captain and then did kind of a deep dive into the captain's life and his impact on the team, and how did the captain's characteristics allow for the dynasty to grow. And so one of his chapters is called Carrying Water from the Back, or Carrying Water from the Rear, which obviously I think speaks to humility. And he highlights a man by the name of Tim Duncan. Tim Duncan was an 18-year career NBA All-Star, probably top 10 players of all time. He won 5 NBA championships with the San Antonio Spurs. And Tim Duncan, throughout this chapter, is consistently described as carrying water from the back. He sacrificed salary for the good of the team. He was always serving others. Some years he focused on scoring because that's what his team needed. Some years he focused on defense. Some years he focused on rebounding. Whatever the case was, he was willing to sacrifice his own personal glory for the benefit of the team. And interestingly enough, Tim Duncan played 18 years for the San Antonio Spurs. He holds the single most wins by a player for an individual franchise. And he also never missed the playoffs in 18 years. And so I think, like, in terms of success, pretty profound career. What's really interesting is we compare Tim Duncan to another man that we're all very familiar with, and that's Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls in the 90s did not make Sam Walker's list of dynasty. It didn't check off all the algorithms. And it was primarily based on the fact that Michael Jordan was the captain. And Michael Jordan's captaincy was filled with contradictions to Tim Duncan. Michael Jordan led his teammates by needling them, by competing with them. If you listen to Michael Jordan's speech at his Hall of Fame acceptance, his speech was all about slights in his life and how he worked to overcome the slights. Another interesting fact is Michael Jordan never won an NBA championship without a co-captain. His first 3 NBA championships, the co-captain was Bill Cartwright. Bill Cartwright was the essence of carrying water from the back. And up until Cartwright was named captain, Jordan's teams didn't make the playoffs, lost in the first round, lost in the second round to the Pistons, like consistently were falling short. Bill Cartwright's named captain, and they go on to win 3 straight. Jordan steps away from the game. Scottie Pippen is named co-captain for the next 3 years. Michael Jordan continued to play, and he played for the Washington Wizards. They didn't make the playoffs, and he was kind of just out there doing the same type of leadership that he had demonstrated before. And I think what's really curious and really interesting, if you watched the film The Last Dance and you looked at Michael Jordan and you took a look at his eyes and you took a look at what he was kind of about, it's clear that something is lacking in his life when the competition has stepped away. And conversely, you look at Tim Duncan, and Tim Duncan retired, and I don't think anybody's heard anything about him whatsoever. And he has gone on to just raise his family and live life as a dad. And I think that speaks really loudly to leadership and what leadership really is and how to really apply humility in an authentic way. And I think the last thing to mention is that humility is so counterintuitive to humanity. An age-old question that we can debate back and forth is, are humans inherently good or are they inherently evil? And people speak oftentimes, and philosophers have debated this question for thousands of years. My personal belief is that I think as human beings, we are bent. We are bent. We are bent by design to be selfish. And that's exactly why we need Christ in our lives, is to fight that selfishness. And Christ in our lives helps us to develop humility from our own internal desires to pursue more of Christ and less of us. I think a great example of this is the most innocent form of humanity, I think, is a baby. I don't think anybody would argue that. But then the question becomes, is what does a baby first do when they're born into this world? The first thing they do is they cry. And they are crying because crying activates their lungs. So at the core of that baby is survival. And even as you go on looking at the baby's life, that baby is about as selfish as they come for the first 5 to 10. And listen, those of us that have teenagers, it just continues. And selfishness is an inherent part of, that maturation process. And perhaps it's a leap, but I don't think it's that much of a leap. If we are selfish, I do believe that we are bent towards evil, because selfishness is this desire to put oneself first and to consistently recognize that we put ourselves first. And humility is the absolute opposite of that. And that's why, to me, humility is so stinking hard. It's so hard. So hard. And there's days that I can do it really well, and then there's other days where I'm just like, frankly, I want to do what I want to do. And I think that kind of speaks to the relationship for Christ in terms of the overall development of leadership, is this concept of bringing humility home with Christ at the forefront of our lives. And the other great example I always give, like if you're walking down the street and you see somebody park their BMW 2 blocks ahead, the guy comes out of his car, he's kind of dressed to the nines, pulls his phone out of his pocket and something drops. He doesn't know it, but you see it. So you kind of speed up, you walk up to the car, and you look down, and lo and behold, it's a $100 bill. Now, the gentleman that dropped the $100 bill is about 2 blocks up. In a moment of accountability and self-reflection, I'm having the conversation with the little red guy on this shoulder and the little blue guy on this shoulder about what I'm going to do with this $100 bill. And I think that's exactly where humility comes in, and I think that's exactly what leadership is about. It's about serving, it's about bringing the accountability home, and it's about operating with integrity. And so that's kind of Just a couple of quick examples, a couple of quick things to think about when it comes to leadership, humility and integrity. And I think the other thing to realize is that life is a process. One of the Wells core values is life is a process, learn it well. And I think that's very much applies to humility and integrity and the realization that we will fall short. But the goal is to get better and to do better each and every day, and we can really only do that operating with Christ at the forefront of our lives. So, appreciate the time. Thank you for indulging me to pontificate about things perhaps that might apply to your life.